Something else you might do this week is interviewing and observation. That is, if you want to solve a learning problem, it could help to talk to the people who need the learning or see what they're doing that could be improved upon by learning. So you should be able to take the theories of learning and apply them to a real problem. One of the problems I've mentioned before is this idea of a geography professor needs to put his course online. So if you're putting a course online, what is, say, a behaviorist way to do it? Well, a behaviorist would say you need to give rewards and punishments. So you might give points and more points for the behaviors you want. You might even take away points for the behaviors you don't want. A cognitivist approach would take more account of internal mental processes and would be very concerned about how much information you get. Because if you get too much information all at once, it's very hard to process it. And if you don't know what you're doing with it, then you really kind of can't process it. For instance, there have been a lot of studies that if you have some kind of chart or diagram and you have some text explaining it, people are far more likely to learn if the text is very small and it's right on the diagram. Apparently, the amount of work it takes to look away from the diagram and to the text and figure out what you're looking at is enough of a drain that it's a weight on learning. It decreases the effectiveness of the learning experience. So a geography professor might be very cognizant of that if he took a cognitive approach to online instruction. The humanist approach, as opposed to punishing people, you'd want to respect and understand them. In studies of classroom learning, one of the biggest drivers of student learning is when the instructor smiles at the whole class, not just one or two students. It kind of suggests how important a sense of respect is and is foundational for the learning process. Obviously, you can't necessarily do that online, so you'd have to find some way, from a humanist perspective, to find what the students were interested in, make sure that their thoughts and feelings were understood or reflected back, in a sense, by the course. So if you gave them something challenging, to be able to hear that it was challenging and accept the authenticity of that experience. In a constructivist approach, learners are building knowledge. They're making it, and they're making it together. So you wouldn't say, take this information about geography and remember it. You might ask the students to make their own explanations, or you might say, well, you have a map of this, and you have this information. How can you put this information on the map? They'd actually be building a mental representation, maybe even a physical representation of their knowledge. In a social constructivist approach, it would be important for students to imitate and observe. They'd have to see the things that they were going to do, and you would want to support their sense of agency, their sense that they were a doer, that they were capable. And you only feel capable and really have a good learning experience in this view if the challenge that you overcome is somewhat substantial. If you give the students trivial things to do and give them little points, it's not challenging, and so they don't get the sense of agency, the I can do it feeling. So you would want to make sure the tests were challenging enough that you could people could feel that success was meaningful. In terms of understanding this instructional problem, before you even got started, you might want to interview and observe students who were currently taking the class, or if the class were already running and you were redesigning it, you might want to look at the students' online behavior. You might want to talk to them. You might say, take the high-performing students and the low-performing students and interview those to try and kind of contrast those experiences. Excuse me, since you can't do a controlled experiment, you have to look at the learners that you have. So if you're a behaviorist looking for information, excuse me, I'm back. So if you're trying to help a geography professor put a course online, the theory of learning would determine what kind of information you wanted. If you were interviewing people, you might talk to the high-performing students and the low-performing students, or talk to students across a range to see if you can correlate the information you get with how successful they are in the course. If you're a behaviorist, you might think, well, I want to give people rewards and punishments, so you might try and find out by interviewing them what they consider to something beneficial and something negative. If you were a cognitivist, you might interview people to find out what mental processes that they were using. What did successful students do? What were their kind of study habits and work habits? Did they look at different materials? What made their learning more successful in terms of thinking and thought processes? If you were a humanist, you might look at how the professor treated the students. You might do that with observation. Was the professor very respectful to all the students? Do students feel listened to? Or does this professor, say, not take questions or things like this? From the social constructivist perspective, you might think, well, they're building their learning together. They're building their knowledge together. What are social interactions among students? Do students who are successful in the course interact more, whereas people who study by themselves perhaps perform less well? You might go and observe to see these rewards. You might, in observing students, see when students are getting stuck. From a cognitive perspective, are they having information overload? You might ask to see the students' notes, either from the cognitive perspective or the constructivist perspective. How are they building their understanding? And you could also observe to see, are students modeling behavior for each other? Are they imitating each other's behavior in a way that's positive or possibly detrimental?